Thank you for playing the Reacting to the Past game, Engines of Mischief. This video is to help players make some arguments from contemporary primary sources. It is especially about arguments for why the government should help hand workers as opposed to factory workers. That is the weavers and spinsters in our game. Don't forget our game is about the Industrial Revolution, and it's set in Manchester, England in the years 1817 and 1818. In Town Hall, players are attempting to get the aristocrats to pass certain laws to help them. Depending on what game you're playing and what the game master wants players to talk about, there will be certain topics in each session of Town Hall. So this video will cover topics in Town Hall about government help for weavers and spinsters, and it includes certain bills that can be moved and that the aristocrats can vote on, like changing the minimum wage or taxes. What the bills are and what the topics are for Town Hall will again depend on the specific game master and the game that's being played. But this video will be about this topic, help for weavers and spinsters in hand production. All the arguments can be found in the core text section of the game book. So for example, there are arguments from petitions to committees of the House of Commons. There are books by, for example, T.R. Malthus, passages from them, and there are some articles from newspapers like Cobbett's Weekly Political Register and the London Times. In Town Hall, if the subject is government help for hand weavers and spinsters, there are certain bills that aristocrats could pass based on these core texts, and that includes minimum wage or changing taxes. So that's what this PowerPoint will cover. Don't forget at this time that hand workers, those are workers in traditional jobs that make textiles by hand in their own homes, were having problems. Their wages have been declining increasingly over the past few decades because of competition for machine-made textiles and because of lower demand after the Napoleonic Wars. So their wages had gone down from 20 shillings a week to 10 shillings a week, and families were suffering considerably because they were not making enough money really to live comfortably. Lower wages and impoverishment was one of the reasons that the working class at this time period staged a number of Luddite raids or attacks on machines. So we'll begin by talking about some contemporary arguments for why the government should pass a minimum wage law. And as this passage indicates, this was a very popular argument at the time. It says that the leading remedy for the problems of hand weavers is a minimum wage, a wage below which manufacturers cannot go. And this parliamentary commission gave evidence from people who supported the minimum wage as well as people who opposed it. So this helps our game players because some of them will support it, some of them will oppose it, and they can find arguments in the core text for both sides. So we'll start out with arguments in favor of a minimum wage law. And this one is a little bit complicated, so I'm providing some summaries of what's said here. But players should always be able to go back to the original text to get more evidence, more details, and some quotes they can use in their arguments in Town Hall. So what this one is talking about is that labor should not be unprotected. So what they're arguing here really is that the minimum wage is fair because there are laws to protect the income of other taxpayers. So people who pay taxes have their income protected by the government. And of course, this includes the aristocrats who passed corn laws that keep the prices of agricultural products high, which keeps their rents high, which protects their income. This passage also talks about how shopkeepers' income is protected because those people who want to sell the same goods on the streets have to have a license, so it discourages them from selling the same goods and protects the shopkeepers. So the argument here is that weavers pay taxes, so they should be treated like other taxpayer, and their incomes should be protected, and their income is their wage. So it's only fair that the government will protect their wage if they're protecting the income of other social classes. Um, this argument also is that it's the government who should regulate and protect wages because the employers of the hand workers are the ones who are always trying to reduce wages in order to maximize their profits, so they can't be trusted. So here's another argument in favor of minimum wage. And what this is saying is that the minimum wage law is not just fair, it's also possible. Wages are a very small very small part of the price of any product. So this person, John Malcolm, who is a manufacturer, is arguing that he wouldn't have to raise the prices of his product that high if he raised wages. So in fact, he suggests that wages could be increased by about 25% with a minimum wage law, and it wouldn't hurt his business. He also argues that the British are rich enough to afford the slightly higher prices that they would have to pay for textiles if wages were raised, and that they would be perfectly happy to do this because they know it would help all workers lead a better life. So this person argues that customers would not mind paying slightly more if they knew that this was going to make the hand weavers and spinsters comfortable. Again, here's another argument um, that minimum wage law is good because the workers will have more money to buy things. They'll be able to buy things like more tobacco, more tea, more sugar, more malt, more of everything that is taxable. So this means not only do they increase the demand for these products by having a higher wage protected by the government, but they'll bring in more tax money to the government. Um, and this person continues to argue that a minimum wage law will make people loyal to the government because they'll be happy and they'll thank the government. And finally, again, this is a similar argument as before, is that customers will be happy to pay a slightly higher price for these advantages. And in fact, they suggest that, maybe they'll pay one extra shilling for a lady's gown, and they wouldn't mind that because they know that it will help demand for manufactured goods, it'll bring in more tax money, it'll make people loyal to the government, and it will make the workers happy. This one is about landowners, in other words, the aristocracy, and they're the ones who can vote for a minimum wage law. And it argues that they should favor minimum wage law because the government helped increase their incomes with the corn laws, which means they have extra money and they can afford higher textile prices that might come with a minimum wage law. In other words, they should be able to pay one shilling more for the gowns that their wives and daughters buy than they do at present. Also, it is their fault that a minimum wage is necessary, that wages have to go up because the corn laws increased food prices, which is why workers need higher wages, so they should support the government providing higher wages. Um, and it's also arguing that this is one of the duties of government to ensure that all hardworking, honest workers can live in comfort. And finally, here again is the argument that happier workers will be loyal to the government and they will thank the aristocracy, which will keep the aristocrats in control of the government. If the workers are not miserable, if they don't want a revolution, this will in fact help the aristocracy maintain their power. In addition to these arguments made from a government commission, players could also use arguments from Adam Smith or Robert Owen. And again, this can be players of all social classes who understand these arguments. Here is a passage from The Gorgon, which is a radical political publication that was well known to workers in Manchester. And again, they're talking about Adam Smith. So this is something that our weavers and spinsters can use. And this is one of the most famous quotes from Adam Smith, that no society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of its members are poor and miserable. In other words, there should be a minimum wage law because um, it will make all of society happy by making the poor happy. And then it continues, it's but equity besides that they who feed, clothe, and lodge the whole body of the people should have such a share of the produce of their own labors as they themselves tolerably well fed, clothed, and lodged. So in other words, it is good for society to pay higher wages with a minimum wage law, and it is equity. It is only fair that there is a minimum wage law. And again, players can use Robert Owen, who talks about how business owners will make more money if they're living machines, if their workers are taken care of and are happy. So now we have some arguments against the minimum wage law for people who don't believe in it. These should be fairly common to people today. So here's the first one, and it's about being very averse to fettering trade at all. In other words, interfering with supply and demand. So the minimum wage law is bad because it involves government interference in the economy, and this is going to hurt business. It should be supply and demand regulating wages, not the government. And if the government passes a minimum wage law, the wages will be artificially high, which will mean that no one will want to buy products because the cost of those wages will have to be added to the price of the product. The prices will increase, and the British products will not be able to compete, particularly with Europeans who have lower wages, and especially if they don't have a minimum wage law. So this argument is that high wages will mean high product prices for textile products, which means that the British cannot compete with foreign textile producers. There'll be a lower profit. There'll be failed businesses. Um, this one is slightly different. It's that the minimum wage law is unnecessary because business owners who are intelligent and who will be successful know that they have to pay high enough wages so that their workers can live well. And this is sort of an argument of Robert Owen also. They'll be smart enough to pay high wages, so it's not really necessary for the government to have a minimum wage law. Again, here's one that's slightly different, and this one says that the minimum wage law hurts the hand weavers. If hand weavers get a minimum wage law, they will not look for better jobs. They will continue in hand weaving. And they will not move into factories, which actually pay higher wages. So this means they'll remain poor, and if the hand production business declines further, which it probably will because of the competition of machines and factories, these hand workers will forever be poor and miserable. They might have to even go into the workhouse. So a minimum wage law will discourage hand workers from changing jobs, working in factories, and actually moving into the modern economy, which is the future. Again, here's another argument about how the minimum wage law actually hurts hand workers. This, again, is about how British textiles will be too expensive to compete in the European market because prices will have to rise. This means that the hand loom manufacturers, the business owners, their businesses will suffer and they will be forced to lower wages even further. So wages might be low now, but if a minimum wage law is passed that raises wages, it will ultimately, in the long term, mean that the business owners will really suffer and wages will not remain high forever. And it could mean that the handloom businesses will fail. Weavers will then just lose their jobs entirely, so they will have no wages whatsoever. And this will encourage the use of machines by manufacturers because this minimum wage law is just for hand workers. So manufacturers will move into machine production, and so the hand producers' wages and jobs will suffer even further. So now here are some arguments about taxation. Um, don't forget that after the wars with France meant that taxes increased, an income tax was passed, and there were many, many more, both domestic and foreign taxes. When the wars were over, the aristocrats in government abolished the income tax, but they raised indirect taxes, including sales taxes on domestic goods and taxes on foreign goods, like the Corn Laws. So this meant that the rich were paying less in taxes and everyone else was paying more. So there were lots of people arguing that the tax structure should change. Um, Also in the core text is a passage about indirect taxes that claims that the workers, our weavers and spinsters in the game, paid half of their income in indirect taxes. So that means that tax burden was very, very high. The direct tax, the property tax or income tax, had been a graduated tax where the rich paid the most and the poor paid nothing, but it was abolished in 1816. So players in the game can argue that indirect taxes should be either reduced or repealed altogether, and they can argue that an income or a property tax could be brought back. So we'll start with arguments for the income or property tax. In other words, for bringing back the income or property tax. And these arguments we'll just summarize really quickly here and not go over any passages. But first, that it was fair. The income tax that was graduated meant that those who are most able to pay tax will not suffer. They'll pay a little bit more, but they can afford it because they're so wealthy. It's only a small percent of their income. It won't really impact their lifestyles. They're not going to starve. But it would make it possible to reduce the indirect taxes on the working class that are really a very, very serious burden on them, as this cartoon shows. And the extra money that the working class has that they're not paying in taxes will really help them and their lifestyle. So really, there can be more arguments for why the income or property tax is good, but basically it is a way to help the poorer people, help them lead a better lifestyle. So now are some arguments against the income or property tax because these are slightly more complicated. And these are arguments that the wealthy people in the game, the aristocracy, but also the wealthy middle class will support because many of them are, as this cartoon shows, sick of the property tax. It makes them like physically nauseous. They really, really oppose it. So here's some arguments, a little bit complicated and very because they're unfamiliar to people today against the property tax. Basically, this is arguing that it is a violation of privacy. It means that respectable gentlemen have to reveal the details of their private wealth to tax collectors who tend to be lower class officials and who force them to give their property away, which also is a form of tyranny. So it's a form of tyranny. It's a violation of freedom. It's a violation of property. Of course, today we're used to the government knowing everything about our income and our property, but this wasn't really the case in the early 19th century. So for aristocrats, it seemed despotic, arbitrary, a precedent to tyranny to start asking people how much money they had. Another argument is that it will hurt business owners. Um, it reduces their income and the capital that keeps the economy alive. So they will not have extra money to expand their businesses, or their businesses will fail because they're paying so much in taxes, which means they won't be able to provide more jobs, raise the wages of their workers, or have cheaper goods. And the argument is that the income tax, as a result of hurting the wealthy, will hurt the poor because there will be fewer jobs and lower wages. So those people who argue against an income or a property tax will probably also argue for indirect taxes. They will be arguing that the tax money lost from an income tax should be made up for with indirect taxes. This argument is for why indirect taxes are better than direct income taxes. And what it's arguing is that sales taxes don't take capital away from business owners. In other words, they don't take the money from the business owners that could be used to expand the business. And it talks about that money as the blood of the economy, the thing that keeps the economy going and flowing. Indirect taxes only tax sweat, things that are consumed and disappear, and that don't actually kill the business, the heart of the business. Many players in the game, however, will argue against indirect taxes, and this particularly will be the lower classes like the weavers and the spinsters. And at this time period, as this cartoon illustrates, people were annoyed by all the little buzzing bees, the swarming tax gatherers collecting all the indirect taxes that were stinging people with little stings, and really causing a lot of harm. So here's some arguments against indirect taxes. This one is that they do hurt business owners. They hurt business owners because they have to raise wages of workers who are paying 50% of their income on taxes. And so in order just to keep the workers alive, they have to raise wages. And so indirect taxes actually encourage business owners to want to leave the country and go to other countries where taxes are less and where wages can be lowered. Again, this one talks about how indirect taxes hurt workers. It lowers their real wages, so what their wage paid by their employers goes less far because they have to pay taxes on so many things. So it creates poverty, unhappiness, crime among the workers, and it hurts business owners because, again, they have to pay higher wages just to keep their workers alive. And again, here's yet another argument that business owners will move to other countries with lower taxes. And if business owners leave, that hurts the workers because that means they're going to lose jobs. So indirect taxes destroy the possibility of improvement in the future, both for workers and for business owners. And the economy will suffer, according to these arguments, because the middle classes will have less money to invest. So that means that wealth cannot trickle down, and it also means that the working classes don't have enough money to buy goods, so there will be less demand for goods. So it hurts like everybody and the economy as a whole. Now we're going to move on to our last set of taxes. These are taxes on foreign products, the corn laws. And don't forget the corn laws imposed a tax or a tariff on cheap foreign grain, and it made foreign grain more expensive in order that British people would buy British grain and not foreign grain. So here are arguments against the corn laws that will be made, particularly by weavers and spinsters. And the main argument here is that they make grain and bread prices higher than anywhere in Europe, and they cause terrible suffering among the poor, which may lead to more lower class disorder. So again, there's always this fear at this time period that there might be a working class revolution, something like the French Revolution, and the Corn Laws, by making the poor so hungry, might cause working class disorder. So really, the argument here is that bread prices are higher than in any country, other country, and this really is completely unfair and very dangerous if they're that miserable. Um, Here are another arguments. Landowners should make sacrifices. They can afford it, so their income will go down if the corn laws are repealed, but they're not going to suffer that much because they're that rich. Um, and everyone else pays more taxes than they do. The middle classes also have to pay higher poor rates. In other words, that's taxes to support the poor law and the poor system, because the corn laws are making the poor, are increasing the poverty of the poor, the need for the poor to rely on the poor laws or the workhouses, which is paid for by people, including the middle classes. So the idea is that the aristocrats can afford to pay to repeal the corn laws or even reduce the corn laws because they're rich enough to do so. Um, Other arguments, um, consequences of the corn laws, it hurts business owners. They have to raise wages because the price of bread is high. Again, they have to make sure that their workers don't starve. And this means they won't compete with foreign producers. They'll lose profit. Once again, they're going to leave the country and move to other countries with lower wages and lower food prices. Um, and if the business owners suffer, if they leave the country, the aristocrats, the landlords who cannot leave the country because they physically own the land, they'll have to cover the cost of the government, the interest on the national debt, and pay more taxes. So in fact, the corn laws will probably make the aristocrats have to pay more in tax. As this cartoon illustrates, many of these arguments that are found in our core text are also in cartoons. So this one, the middle class people over here, John Bull, who actually is the image of Britain himself, says, is arguing against the corn law and says, I will not starve, but quit my native country where the poor are crushed. So once again, that argument that the corn laws are going to encourage people to leave the country is illustrated in many different ways in contemporary texts. Now for some arguments in favor of the corn laws, which will be quite unfamiliar to players today. Here's an argument made by Thomas Malthus, and again, it's about supply and demand. So he argues that without the corn laws, with grain prices will be low, so farmers will not want to grow grain. They might maybe switch to cattle production on the land, but they'll be unwilling to grow grain if the prices of grain is low. That'll happen without the corn laws. What this means is that there'll be no expansion of food production or of grain production in Britain, and Britain will not be able to feed its expanding population, unless, of course, they buy foreign grain. So it'll require the British to rely on foreign grain. And Malthus was a classic thinker who thought that the population was going to expand tremendously. So his argument is that the corn laws mean that the British do not have to rely on foreign grain. And he expands on this here, um, that with the corn laws, it helps the British be self-sufficient in food production. Without them, they're not self-sufficient. They will be dependent on foreign food supplies, and these may be stopped or become more expensive during a period of war when these foreigners, like the French, either prohibit the sale of grain outside of their own country or impose a high tax on grain. So if there's a bad harvest also, in addition to another war, the foreigners will keep all of their grain at home, which means that the British will have no food and their population will suffer. Malthus continues that the corn law is going to repealing the corn law will hurt everybody in the nation. He claims that aristocrats' income will be reduced in half, which means aristocrats can't buy manufactured goods, which means business owners won't get rich, which means they won't expand their business and provide jobs for workers. And also aristocrats cannot pay as much money in taxes if they don't have the corn laws, which will mean less money for the Army and Navy, the inability to pay off the national debt and interest on it. So in a sense, this is sort of a trickle-down theory. By having the aristocrats' income protected by the corn laws, it helps everybody else in society. Their wealth will trickle down to everyone else. By repealing the corn laws, it stops that wealth trickling down. So those are some of the arguments that can be made about why the government should or shouldn't help weavers and spinsters in hand production. The next set of arguments will be about factory conditions and about political reform.